No, look, I think I'd try a fork for a while. These chopsticks really take a little while to get onto. Now, would you bring us a fork, please?
Thanks, Dave. I think that's a little bit better for me at this stage.
See what I mean? Even my wife has trouble with them once in a while. Well, now, getting back to what we were talking about, when you've been out here for a while, you'll discover, as my wife and I have, that this is a really fantastic little country. We've just completed a 4-month survey, and every day we ran across something new. Never knew what to expect. For instance, one day we might be caught up in the crowd in a city market, and then the very next day we would be way out at the end of some jungle trail, sitting in one of those great, long tribal houses surrounded by half-naked savages.
Well, Dave, what is the country like out there?
Well, when you get away from the city of Tourane, the first thing you will see is the magnificent rice fields. They're all around us. There the coolies bend all day long under the blistering sun, planting and harvesting the rice crop. Nearby, the giant wheels are turned lazily by the flow of the river, lifting the water up into their irrigation ditches. And from that point, in the most colorful and interesting methods, the water is thrown and lifted and shoveled into their paddies. Why, we were amazed at the very same method. One of the most common sights out here are the placid-looking water buffalo. But don't let their looks fool you. One day we came upon a group of boys leveling the rice field, and it was as exciting as Ben-Hur in the chariot races. They planted their feet firmly upon the wooden drag, clutched the tails of those animals tightly in their fist, and hanging on for dear life, they went charging down that rice field in a spray of muddy waters. By the time they had done that for a while, they provided good material for a soap commercial. In addition to rice, fish is a staple of the Vietnamese diet. All along the coast are hundreds of little fishing villages. Their harbors are jammed with fishing vessels, crowded with people. Some of these spend their entire lives aboard the boats. The predominant religion of Vietnam is Buddhism, which has a stranglehold upon the people. It's a religion which prescribes merit-making as a means of reincarnation in better circumstances. Why, even Buddha himself claimed no fewer than 550 rebirths, all of which he professed to have remembered. One night my wife and I were caught in a crowd of chanting devotees as they followed beautiful, electrically lit floats commemorating these rebirths. Beyond the coastal area are thousands of animistic tribespeople whose religion requires the constant offering of blood. The communists are influencing these tribespeople against the government. And in order to deal with that problem, the government is sponsoring festivals, or fêtes as they are called there. One day my wife and I came across one of these festivals in progress. It was attended by many military officials and the school children, all performing for the benefit of these tribespeople. Thousands of the tribespeople had come down from the jungles and surrounding mountain areas. Here, tribal chiefs, as a token of friendliness, sipped rice alcohol with the government officials. But the climax was blood sacrifice. The dancing girls gyrated about the pole. The boys beat their drums savagely while the animal was led to the slaughter. Now the girls stepped back, and the old men drew forward, for to them was given the honor of the kill. We were shocked as we watched them torture and torment that animal for hours. For their belief is, the more it suffers, the more efficacious for the appeasement of the demon. After a while, we anticipated that the end was near, but it came with such suddenness. So another animal was sacrificed to appease the demon. And not far from that scene of heathen cruelty, a Christian baptism was taking place. The power of Christ was overcoming vain superstitions and cruel, heartless customs. For many years, Gordon and Laura Smith have carried a great burden for these tribespeople of central Vietnam. Now at last, their vision is being fulfilled. Their dream is coming true. Gordon selected Tourane as the most strategic spot to begin his medical and evangelistic program among those tribespeople. Here he established a Bible school to train national workers who are becoming missionaries to these tribes. They are trained in a thorough 5-year program, 3 years in the classroom, and 2 years of practical work. Now, I don't want you to think that we don't need more missionaries. We do. But our emphasis must be upon training national workers. The communist threat makes this imperative. We don't know how long this door will remain open. So each year, we are placing additional students out upon our little stations. There they face all sorts of hardships and hazards. Just recently, one of our young men, the father of 4 children, was carried off by the communists, and we haven't heard from him since. In spite of all the difficulties and hardships, these young people are doing a magnificent work. Take the story of Chan, for example. He and his young wife, although they had come from wealthy Buddhist homes, went back to live in a 1-room grass shack to open up a new area. God's blessing was upon that young man's ministry from the very beginning. In a short time, 30 people were baptized, and today there are over 100 believers on that station. And now those new converts have raised all the funds to build their own church. But something even more remarkable took place. Those new converts were burdened to preach the gospel to the surrounding areas, and today they have built a second church, and no help from the missionary whatsoever has gone into that new work. With these evidences of God's blessing upon the work, frequent conferences are held with our national brethren to discuss further advances. Our strategy is to open little stations out on the very edge of tribal territory. We call them beachhead stations, for there we are securing our first toehold into tribal territory. Now something truly remarkable is happening out here that I would like to show you. You know, Ward, there's really nothing to keep us from moving ahead at full speed here in our evangelization program. The country is suddenly opening up before us. I trust that we'll not miss this golden opportunity that God has given us. There's something I want to show you on a map. Chinghao, would you mind bringing me that map, please? There's a miracle happening. Overnight, we've been able to establish stations all the way down this new territory. Thank you, Chinghao. These new stations can be seen here by the dots. I would say in about 2 years now, we have opened 30 stations all along this range of mountains.
Dave, judging from that map there, that looks like mighty rough country. How do you get out to this?
Well, the country is rough, but that's one of the miracles that's happening. The government is opening a great network of roads all the way from this communist boundary right on down to Saigon, the capital city. The purpose of these new roads is to flush the communists out. They're raising havoc with this new government. But of course, for us, it's accelerating our program by years. It used to take us in some areas about 2 weeks to get out there. Now we can make it in a matter of hours. There's no time to lose. As new areas open, we follow. These roads are being sponsored by the American Foreign Aid Program, and American engineers are providing the technical know-how. Now, we endeavor to keep in close touch with these engineers in order that we might enter the new areas as quickly as they are opened. We know that false cults, materialism, and the sins of the white man will follow right behind these bulldozers. And may God help us as the Church of Christ to be there before them with the Christian message. We made many trips from our headquarters in Tourane along these new roads to our little stations scattered through the jungles. There were rivers to ford and ferries to cross. And one day we followed those roads all the way north to one of our stations just 11 miles south of the communist boundary. Arriving at this station, we had a definite feeling of uneasiness, for we realized that just 11 miles beyond these hills was the communist border, the line between freedom and slavery. On one occasion, while we were camping in the open, a band of communists crept to within 1.5 miles of our camp and killed 5 men. But even so, sleeping in the open was preferable to those stifling Vietnamese huts where not a breath of air got through. Sometimes we were lucky enough to find a thatched veranda as a shelter, under which we could put up our camp cots and string our mosquito nets. It didn't take us long to really appreciate this netting, as every bug that flew, walked, and crawled tried to go to bed with us. After a day's travel on these hot Vietnamese roads, we were always ready to turn in early, and even the old army cots felt good. Laura was usually the first up in the morning, and while our cook busied himself with the breakfast, our chauffeur would get the day's supply of water. But one day, he drove off forgetting our mosquito net was tied to the back of the Land Rover. And that one morning, we had a most unceremonious awakening. Our day at the station began with a hearty breakfast. At times, the crowd jammed about watching us curiously, and our cook, who always accompanied us on these trips, would keep them back saying, "If you watch the white man eat, you make the food stick in his throat." Wherever possible, we built our beachhead stations near a market center, and after breakfast we visited the markets near the station. Here we saw the most colorful tribesmen from the surrounding mountains and jungles mingling with the Vietnamese to buy, trade, and sell. They brought in their cinnamon bark, rattan rope, and hand-woven cloth, and returned to their remote villages with salt, rice, pots and pans, and quite an assortment of beads and trinkets. These markets provide an unparalleled opportunity to preach the gospel to the tribespeople who gather here from miles around. One day, an entire village had come from the mountains to the market to trade, and we seized this unique opportunity to preach the message of eternal life to this village. On the white sandy beach along the river, we gathered the people, and there Laura set up her colorful flannel graph and began to preach the message of Christ to these people, most of whom had never heard his name before. She began with an illustration familiar to them all, the buffalo sacrifice. And from that point she began to unfold to them the old story of God's redeeming love and Christ's infinite sacrifice upon Calvary's cross. It was a time of earnest heart-searching. For some, the price was too great. The fear of demons and death kept them from breaking with their blood offerings. But praise God, others stepped out boldly for Christ, cutting their sacrifice strings from their wrists, strings which had been placed there to show they had offered blood to appease the demons. Near these market centers, we have now established 30 beachhead stations, and one of the purposes of our trip was to visit these. The little stations are like beacons, radiating light to the thousands of tribal dwellings in the mountains and jungles beyond. Besides the spiritual ministry on these stations, they also serve as centers for a widespread medical program. The tremendous need out here demands that we do something on a scale equal to the great challenge before us, and the training of nationals seems to be the answer. During our trip, we were deeply impressed by the work of these nationals, particularly one lovely young nurse, Grace Nook, the only medical help for thousands of people. They came in a steady stream with every imaginable ailment, greatly aggravated by the dirt and heat of the jungle. Clean clothes and a bar of soap were often the first steps in treatment. Our two main weapons are prayer and penicillin, and some of the little patients didn't seem to mind the prayer nearly as much as the penicillin. But there was usually a happy ending. With so many children about, I often made a little jumping mouth from my handkerchief to keep them amused and their minds from the needle. We were highly amused by the unique way they made their clothing stretch. Pajamas sent to us by friends back home did double duty. One child would wear the top, the other the bottom. These national nurses are a constant source of wonder to us. Some, like Grace, have had only 6 months medical training, yet they constantly deal with the most difficult cases under primitive conditions. Why, even while we were with her, Grace was called to a little Vietnamese home where a child was suffering with a terribly infected leg. For 3 days, while the parents stood by in helpless anguish, she worked on that leg, draining it with a hypodermic needle and administering penicillin. Finally, thanks to her loving and skillful care, the child's life was saved, but even more wonderful, the parents of that child heard the message of salvation and were saved from their sins, taking Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Most of our outpost stations are located on the very edge of civilization, and in order to penetrate further into the jungles over the unbelievably rough and primitive roads, we were forced to leave the trailer behind. Some of the roads were so steep and slippery that everyone but the driver was forced to get out and walk to lighten the load. Often we were the very first civilians to travel these roads which were just being opened. Once a military jeep just ahead of us rolled over down a steep grade and narrowly missed, plunging over the precipice. We thought nothing could be worse than the climb up some of these steep mountains, but the descent to the valley beyond was even more harrowing. At times we wondered if the better part of wisdom would be to turn back. When we came to the end of the last road, we unloaded the Land Rover at the river and made the best of the available transportation. There, 3 sampans and several coolies were hired to take us even deeper into the jungle. The rivers that twist through the magnificent valley still provide an important means of travel in some areas. This river journey was most fascinating as our coolies rowed and pulled us along chanting a boatsman's song in the minor key. At the rapids, our coolies ganged up to drag the sampans through one at a time, and in order to lighten the load for them, we waded ashore. That is, except for Laura. Near these rivers, we would make our camp and set out from them on foot over the lonely jungle trails, often crossing and recrossing the mountain streams. At the end of these trails, we always found yet another village, hidden, alone, and forgotten. Time Time after time, we were the first outsiders to invade their jungle domain. At the sight of the tall white strangers, the little children, with baby brother or sister strapped to the back, scrambled into their huts for safety or just burst into tears. The older folks, usually less timid, would invite us into their huts where we would be immediately surrounded by curious, half-naked savages. Generally meant a great feast, but we couldn't get too excited about these, for we never knew exactly what to expect. Elephants are the tractors of the jungle and seem to enjoy the tribespeople's food more than we did. We caught one of these stealing from the natives' food supply and coaxed his owner, the village chief, for a ride. The howdah was strapped into place, and using his head for a stepping stone, we scrambled aboard. He plopped his big old pile driver feet down one after another, and at 2 miles an hour I would just as soon have walked. All this did, however, help to break down the fear and allowed us to move about the village freely. These villages were a strange new world to us, where life was carried on in the same primitive ways of their ancestors. People. Literally everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest granny, smoked his long-stemmed pipe or home-rolled cigar. Day after day we sat with these simple people preaching the liberating gospel of Christ, which alone could break the cords that bind them to cruel and heartless customs, such as sawing off 6 of their upper teeth. Tooth sawing stems from the belief that a child with long teeth will grow up with a wild, animal-like nature. So at the age of 11 or 12, the little children are held down while a butcher saws away at their teeth with a crude steel blade, cutting right through the bare nerves without anesthetic or drugs. It's beyond belief that the poor child can stand the horrible shock to the nervous system. By the time the agonizing ordeal has ended, the little face is swollen badly and drenched with perspiration, as hot lacquer is applied to the stumps of those teeth in an effort to seal off the exposed nerves. This is heathen darkness in its rawest form. And yet, do you know, I've heard people back home say, the heathen are happy, let them alone. We're constantly burdened with the knowledge that multiplied thousands are still living in these conditions, alone and forgotten, out where those rivers begin and the trails run out. One day, Gordon and I, together with some of our national workers, said goodbye to the ladies and set out for an area never before entered by the missionaries. We picked our way gingerly across those creaking log bridges. On other occasions, we sloshed our way through vile-smelling swamps. At one point, as we climbed a high ridge and sat down to rest, we heard the sharp staccato drum beats and low moan of the gongs in the distance. There across the valley from where we sat, we sighted a village from which the drum beats seemed to be coming. We decided to head for that village, but between us and it was an old, decayed-looking vine suspension bridge, strung precariously 40 feet above the river. Picking our way over this swinging bridge with the drums ever growing louder wasn't exactly soothing to our nerves. Eventually we arrived at the village where the drummers were beating the buffalo skin drums and great bronze gongs. And a gaudily dressed old sorcerer was calling upon the spirits of the north, south, east, west, the rocks, rivers, and whirlpools disease were ravaging their village, and the evil spirits must be appeased. When the animal was finally killed, the skull was then cleaned, dried, and hung with the others inside their longhouse as protection against demons. The old sorcerer mixed the animal's blood with strange powders, all the while calling upon the spirits, and then smeared the blood around the village in an effort to halt the disease which was all around. But their superstition could not stay the hand of death and disease, and their children were brought to us for help. One young mother brought her child which was in the most pitiful condition. We had no medicine with us on this trip, but determined to bring help to this village, Gordon and I returned to our little jungle camp as quickly as possible. There we found Laura, Gwen, and our nurse Grace ministering to the tribespeople around the area. We explained the situation to them, and the following day Gwen, Grace, and some of our national workers accompanied me back to that little village. We soon left the beauty of the mountain rice paddies behind and followed a narrow, twisting trail through the steaming jungles on our return journey to that waiting mother and her desperately sick child. It was a long, hard walk, and 3 days passed by before we got to that village again. We had promised that mother, God willing, we'd be back. She was waiting for us, and Grace coaxed her into the light in order to treat the baby. As Gwen and I looked, we were stunned to see what 3 days in the tropics could do to an infection. The little head had split open from the ear to the center of its throat. We were inspired by the confidence, courage, and tenderness shown by our brave nurse as she began treatment upon that child. These conditions existed all around us, and day after day we looked upon human misery, suffering, and hopelessness, until sometimes we thought we could stand no more. Gwen and I stood out there for the best part of an hour, watching Grace do her very best to save that little child's life. And as we watched, we were thankful to God for every national worker and missionary who is bringing medical help and salvation to those who have been neglected so long. But, Ward, we simply do not have enough missionaries here to meet this great need. And our thoughts carried us away to the thousands upon thousands of tribespeople living out along those little jungle trails, alone and forgotten. And there's no one there to care for them, body or soul. And as we thought of them, we kept asking ourselves over and over again, how long are they going to wait? How many thousands more are going to die with no one to care, no one to help them? Well, I suppose you know that we're so hopelessly understaffed here that we just, we have no one to place on these stations, and the missionaries were so happy when you came. And believe me, Ward, as soon as you finish this language study, we're going to have you out on one of those outpost stations. Here, the mighty force of Christian love has clashed head-on with heathen violence and the modern savagery of unleashed communism. Christ, the bright and hope of the world, is now being proclaimed to a people who for centuries have been abandoned to an existence of unimaginable ignorance, vain superstitions and demon worship, cruel and heartless customs, dread diseases which ravage their villages like untamed beasts. But here a new chapter in Christian heroism is being written by a handful of missionaries and national workers who labor side by side in a daring effort to snatch these people from the clutches of heathen darkness. And as we watched our young men and women labor among a people who for centuries had been shamefully neglected, we were overwhelmed with the realization that their eternal destiny depended upon these workers and you.